Hello, Science 30, and welcome to the first part of our physics unit called Radiation and Space. We are going to be breaking this down into a couple of lessons. So the first few lessons are going to involve lesson 1 on the electromagnetic radiation spectrum, or EMR. We're then going to move into lesson 2 about wave equations, and then end up with lesson 3 on fusion and fission. So during these lessons, we are going to be covering a couple of outcomes. So in lesson 1, the electromagnetic radiation spectrum, we're going to describe the electromagnetic spectrum from long to low frequencies, looking at all the different types. We're going to compare and contrast various parts of it, such as frequency, wavelength, and the effects on our living tissue. We're also going to eventually talk about the atmosphere and how it absorbs these frequencies, identify technologies that apply to EMR, as well as look at the advancements in scientific knowledge around the universe because of EMR. So let's start off with just the types of the electromagnetic radiation and the EMR spectrum. So where does electromagnetic radiation originate from? So this EMR is created when atomic particles, or specifically the electron. So for those of you that need a reminder, an electron is a negatively charged particle that orbits the nucleus of an atom. The nucleus of the atom has protons and neutrons. The electron is found on all these different orbiting areas, and it can move and jump. And when it does, it releases or absorbs energy. So an electron can be accelerated by an electric field, which causes it to move. This movement produces both an electric and magnetic field that travel at right angles to each other, moving at the speed of light. Now, this diagram you're seeing on your screen, you can see the highs and lows of these wavelengths, okay? What you cannot see is there's a third line, and instead of the third line going up and down, it's going out and in. And that out and in is producing a right angle to the electric field. So this is just showing the right angles, or trying to, but it's hard because it's 2D. You have a little bit better of a picture in your notes that kind of shows the high cresting and lows of the wavelengths of the electric field, and then the right angles that are created by the magnetic field. So just like you hear sounds, so if you think about all the different sounds you hear in a day, maybe you heard a siren or a baby crying or someone shouting, okay? Those are created by sound waves that create different pitches. The EMR, or electromagnetic radiation, also has different types of wavelengths that are produced and produce different types of radiation. Each of these have different frequencies and wavelengths. If you look on page 3 of your data booklet, there's actually an electromagnetic spectrum that shows the frequency, or the hertz, and the wavelengths of each of the different types found in the spectrum. I'm going to go through them. I'm also going to explain frequencies and wavelengths, but it is a really good visual to help you see what we're talking about. When we talk about the electromagnetic spectrum, there's a lot that is involved, and we can actually only see a very, very small portion of it, called the visible light. So in your notes, we are going to copy down this lovely little diagram, starting from left to right, showing really long wavelengths to really short wavelengths. And we're going to start by labeling this side radio waves. So the electromagnetic spectrum moves from long wavelengths to short wavelengths from left to right. All right. And we're going to go through and we're going to label them. So this side is radio, then microwaves, infrared, visible. So visible light is the stuff we can see. It's the only part of the spectrum we can see with our eyes. Ultraviolet, X-ray, and then gamma ray. So make sure you draw your line and your squiggles, and then make sure you label each part. Now again, your booklet gives you an idea of the frequency and wavelengths, but we're just going to do this as a general drawing and then make the specifics in our notes in a chart. So on the left-hand side, we have lower energy, lower frequency, and larger wavelengths, which is important to understand that radio waves on average cannot really do tons of damage to us. Now, maybe in high amounts, but if you think about it, radio wavelengths are really long and stretched out. That means that they can be refracted and reflected really easily, and that's what makes them really, really good for communication, is they're able to be bounced all over. But when it comes to having effects on organic cells, they have a hard time. They don't have enough energy to break the bonds between our cells to create damage. Okay, so they can't penetrate our cells very well. Now, that being said, I'm sure in high amounts or in strong amounts, it could, but for the purposes of the radio's wavelengths that pass around us, they're not very damaging. On the other end of the spectrum are very high energy, high frequency, small wavelengths. Now, this is where you can get a lot of damage or issues. So it has a lot of high energy, so it can cause damage to cells. The frequency is much higher, which we'll see in a bit, and they're really small wavelengths, so they're harder to bounce around. If you think about an X-ray, you can see inside your body, so you know that it's able to penetrate your skin or the organic cells that you have. We have learned that X-rays and gamma rays and all that are extremely dangerous. In fact, X-rays, you have to wear a lead bib over your body when you get an X-ray because you want to protect all the cells that carry your genetic material, such as your eggs and sperm, because X-rays can actually cause mutations. So women who are pregnant, their fetus can be damaged if it's not if you go into an X-ray room, but they take precautions. Now, one of the most famous women that I know of in bio, because she's part of bio and she's part of talking about DNA and the double helix and chromosomes, is Rosalind Franklin. And Rosalind Franklin was a crystallographer. She was an X-ray technician back in her time. And she died very young. I think she was only like 34. She might have even been younger, because she used X-rays all the time, but didn't take precautions because they didn't understand the damaging effects of X-rays. So that was back only in the 1950s, or late 1940s, early 1950s. So you have to understand, we've come a long way in understanding the electromagnetic spectrum in a short time. So I kept saying I would explain frequencies and wavelengths. So let's just take a quick look here. So in your note package, there is two parts. So frequency means the number of cycles per second, and we refer to that as hertz. Now, cycles are essentially what we call wavelengths. So if you look over here, a wavelength goes from the crest to the trough to the crest. So essentially it's a top to bottom to top is a wavelength. And one wavelength equals one cycle. All right. So when we're looking at a wavelength, this is a very stretched out wavelength. That's what we would call longer wavelengths. The one below, you can see, happens in a shorter span. So that's a shorter wavelength. The amount of times it goes up and down in a second is called a cycle. And that's how we figure out frequency. So frequency over here, as you can see, this goes up, down, really, really quickly. So in a second, we would measure how many times, and that's the number of cycles per second, which gives us hertz. The higher the frequency, the faster that happens. The lower the frequency, the more stretched out it is. So we're going to go into discussing the different types of EMR. So we're going to start in radio waves, okay? In radio waves, most radio waves have a very low frequency of 3 hertz. So remember, that is the cycles that are happening. This is also found in your note package, your data booklet on page 3. Okay, so it has a really low frequency of about 3 hertz, and its highest wavelength, so remember, wavelength is from top to bottom to top, is at about 100 kilometers. Okay, so that's quite a bit if you think about it. Now, where does this source of radio waves come from? Well, it comes from charged particles undergoing some sort of acceleration. Now, we have naturally emitting radio waves by lightning or some astronomical objects, but essentially all the radio wavelengths that we would think of, like how our phones work or how the radios work, is that they're generated by creating and using transmitters and receivers. All right, so we would create these radio waves by exciting particles. Those radio waves would be transported across to a transmitter and would be received by an antenna. Now, the energy that it produces is 4 times 10 to the negative 19 EV. EV is an electron volt. Okay, an electron volt is just a commonly used unit when we're talking about energy gained by an electron or a charged particle carrying an electronic charge. Okay, so it tells us our electrical potential of that electron as we increase it by volts. All right, so essentially this has a very small amount of energy, 0.0000 blah 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 4 electron volts. So it has a very low amount of energy. We see the uses for the radio waves in TV and radio and satellites. We also can use them in air traffic control and telephones. So a lot of communication purposes are done by radio waves. And there's a lot of ways that radio waves can be passed. They can be triangulated. You can use really, really, really large receivers. You can use really small receivers, but essentially this is the best way to communicate. Microwaves. We know what microwaves are. They have a frequency of about 1 times 10 to the 9 hertz, which creates a wavelength of about 1 meter. Essentially, how does a microwave work is they have inside of them an electron tube, which causes the water in the food, so the water molecules in the food, to vibrate. And when water vibrates, it heats up, because remember, it's going to go from a liquid to a gas. So it creates energy as it goes from one state to the other. And this produces heat that ends up cooking your food. The energy in this is about 1 times 10 to the negative 5 electron volts, or 0.0001 electron volts. And we can use microwave waves, that makes sense, in microwave ovens, wireless networks, actually, radar, satellites, spacecraft communication, some cancer treatments, remote sensing, and radio astronomy. So radio waves are not the only version that we use for communication. Radio astronomy, radar, satellites, things like that can use microwaves. Infrared is at about a frequency of 3 times 10 to the 11 hertz. It's about 1 millimeter in length for the wavelength. Now, infrared radiation comes from thermal radiation. So if you think about people wearing night vision goggles and they're able to see when people are moving around because it goes from green to red or there's blue, okay? It's all about the temperature that radiates, and then you can see different colors, okay? It has an energy of about 0.01. And we can use night vision goggles, meteorology things, thermal imaging cameras, tracking technologies, fiber optic cables, and remote controls. Now, the cool thing about infrared is it's usually mixed with radio waves and microwaves to be able to see out into space. And we can look far into space and try and look at different things. And we can try and map them, and we can see what is their thermal energy, and we can also make shapes out of them. So you can combine different parts of the electromagnetic spectrum to be able to use it to see things. Now, I say see in quotations because we can't actually use them. We're just bouncing wavelengths off of them and creating some sort of picture. Visible light is essentially what we can see. So it's at about 4 times 10 to the 14 hertz. Its wavelength is a little bit smaller at 740 nanometers. So now we're looking at a lot smaller wavelength. The sources are things like the sun, light bulbs, fire, anything that gives off visible light, and its energy is at about 1.8 electron volts. I didn't have a lot for this one because obviously you should know about visible light a little bit and what we use it for. All right, ultraviolet. Ultraviolet is at 8 times 10 to the 14 hertz, 380 nanometers, and we can see the sun and tanning beds giving off ultraviolet rays, and that's why you should wear sunscreen to protect yourself from them, because now we're getting into the part of the spectrum that can penetrate organic matter and can cause damage to cells. Its energy is at about 3 electron volts, and we can use it in medical and dental practices. Ultraviolet light is used for killing bacteria, especially in water treatment plants. We use chlorine and ultraviolet light to kill bacteria so that you don't get sick when you drink water. It can cure inks, meaning put inks on paper and then keep it there so it doesn't run, phototherapy, and sun tanning. X-rays are now again getting into that little bit higher energy, bigger frequencies at 1 times 10 to the 16 hertz, 0.01 nanometers, so really, really tiny wavelengths. Its source comes from a change in electron moving from a higher energy to a lower energy. So remember I explained earlier, electrons can move and release energy. In the case of an X-ray, you're taking an electron from a higher level of energy on the outside of an atom and you're dropping it to a lower one. This causes a lot of energy to be released because it's got to release that energy somewhere, because the rule of energy is it cannot be created nor destroyed. It can only be transferred. So it has to be transferred somewhere. So we release this excess energy, and it usually comes from something like radon, which is a type of atom, or any other radioactive elements. Releases about 124 electron volts, and we use x-rays, as you know, to check for broken bones. You can x-ray your lungs to look for pneumonia. You can get mammograms with x-rays, which essentially looks for breast cancer. So it's used in a lot of medical purposes and helps us know what kind of treatments to use in case of dangerous things like pneumonia. Gamma rays are the last one. They are huge. So they have 1 times 10 to the 20 hertz. That's its frequency. Okay, very, very, very big. The wavelengths are less than 100 picometers. A picometer is 1/1,000,000th of a meter. So they are super, 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 super tiny. On Earth, we look at things like nuclear explosions, lightning, and radioactive decay will have gamma rays. It gives off a massive amount of energy at 100,000 electron volts. And you're going to see its uses in power plants, in some medical fields for radiotherapy. Some industries also use it to sterilize and disinfect. So the last thing we're going to talk about, now that you have all the different types of stuff in your notes about what they are, we're going to talk about the effects it has on the body. So radio waves, as I said already, is not very dangerous to humans in low amounts. It has what we call non-ionizing radiation, meaning it's not going to penetrate your cells very well. But again, it's in low amounts. Microwaves or non-ionizing radiation, again, they're usually not dangerous to humans in low amounts, but they can heat the tissues of the body like it heats food. And so it can actually cause burns. If you think about it, we're made out of a lot of water, so is our tissues. If you are coming into contact with a lot of microwaves, it'll heat up that tissue because the water in it, and you can cause you to have a burn. Infrared, still non-ionizing, not usually dangerous to humans, but again, in low amounts. We don't want to be exposing ourselves to large amounts of this, but it can cause issues in our eyes if we look at it for too long in large amounts. So to help someone who is using infrared for a long period of time, they wear special glasses with infrared filters on them so that they don't damage the retinas of their eyes. The retinas of your eyes are what contains the rods and cones, which helps you see light in light and in dark. And if you wreck your retina, you can't see because the retina is what passes the message back to the brain. Invisible light, again, non-ionizing, not dangerous to us, again, in low amounts, but it can cause skin damage in high amounts. UV rays now are in the ionizing section, okay? So now we're in the parts that can cause damage to humans, especially to DNA, which increases our chances of cancer. So UV rays can mutate our skin cells, which can cause skin cancer, and that's why you should always wear sunscreen when you're in UV rays. X-rays, we also know as ionizing, can cause damage, and it can cause damage to our DNA. Again, it can mutate that DNA that increases our chances of cancer, hence why you wear a lead vest when you're in an X-ray, and why women or men who are X-ray technicians have to stand behind the walls and do the X-rays outside the room. It's because they're always exposed to those wavelengths if they stay inside the room, so they have to take precautions, step outside, so they don't increase the chances of damage to their DNA. And last but not least is gamma rays, ionizing radiation. This can cause damage to the DNA, again, which increases your chances of cancer. Most likely, if you're exposed to gamma rays, you are going to have some issues because they are extremely dangerous. So that's it. In our next video, we're going to talk about the history of EMR discoveries. I hope you have a great day, and I'll talk to you soon.